to the second session of our four-part series on emergency preparedness, exercise, and design. My name is Katie Picciotto, and I am a quality improvement advisor with Superior Health Quality Alliance. I will be facilitating today's call along with my Superior Health colleagues. We have Ali Albers, Mike Bittner, and Penny Clary with us today. Before I introduce our speakers for today's call, I want to take the time to review a few housekeeping items. We will post the slide deck. It looks like Penny has posted that in the chat now. Please feel free to ask questions and comments throughout the way. You can post them in the chat box. As you think of them, we will answer questions at the end of the call. There will also be an opportunity to ask a live question at the end of the call as well. The series is being recorded and will be available on the Superior Health YouTube channel in about 2 weeks. This will allow you and your team to access the recordings on demand when it's convenient for you. We will post an evaluation link at the end of today's call as well. We would really appreciate it if you would take a few minutes and complete that for us. We use the evaluations to improve calls and to also determine if there are other topics you may find information about helpful. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers, Brian Kaczmarski and Amy Woolman-Nesseth. Welcome, Amy and Brian.
Thank you. So we're going to dive right in today. Again, I'm Amy, and Brian is on the phone, on the call as well. We currently work in the Healthcare Coalition system in the state of Wisconsin, but we are also co-owners of Optima EP, which is an emergency preparedness consulting firm. So we are pleased to be here again today. So we are in the midst of a four-part series. Last week, we tried to set the stage for exercise design, or at least exercise introduction, some terminology, some things that we wanted everybody to understand, so we have that foundation to work from. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about emergency preparedness capabilities and how we write or how we develop exercise objectives to go with those capabilities. We're going to talk about the fact that there are two key components to this next step, which is exercise design as well as exercise development. We're going to talk a lot about SMART objectives and what that looks like. And then we're also going to identify, as always, tools and resources that can help you with this part of the exercise design and development process. So let's review. Exercises are daunting, especially if you don't do them often. If it's something brand new to you, it can be very overwhelming, but they are here to stay. And that is because we know that just like any skill, any discipline, whether it's a sport or whether it's a skill at work, if you don't repeat that skill over and over again, if you don't practice, you aren't going to become good at what you need to do in order to be successful. That is also true for emergency preparedness exercises. We kind of always know what we think we would do in an exercise, but or in a real event, but when we actually get a chance to practice it, we find out often that there are gaps in that thinking, and there are things that we can do to improve either personally or as an organization. There are building block approaches to building capabilities and to building and designing exercises. One of the things I think we forget is sometimes we think we have to do like the full scale exercise, lights and sirens, move all the patients out of the building, in order to do an exercise. And that's simply not the case. CMS and FEMA recognize that there are many different steps, building blocks, to get to that full scale exercise. And it can include things like games or a lecture or drills that don't bite off such a big piece at once. And then we talked a lot about capabilities, and then underneath capabilities, there's activities. And in order to complete your activities, you have specific tactics. And so that is the hierarchy and nomenclature that we are going to be using. As we talked about last week, in a lot of the documents that are out there for exercise design and development, you will see a variety of different names, and we will continue to remind you of what those are as we go through the process here. So as I said, this is the building block approach. You can start with just an educational seminar or a workshop where people have an opportunity to learn about a new skill or a new plan or a new process that they would have to employ if there was a real event for an emergency. Tabletop exercises, as Brian said last time, is when you sit around a table and you literally discuss what you would do in a given situation. This does give different players or different people within your leadership team the opportunity to come to the table and to sit around and discuss what they would do in a given situation. You can also create games. There's always an emergency preparedness week or month, just like there's a week for everything. That's a great time to create some word find games or scavenger hunts or different things related to preparedness that can actually count as part of your training and exercise for your staff. Drills, we're all used to doing things like fire drills and tornado drills, things like that. Building in a drill for a specific skill or operational task can count as one of your exercises. And then we get to the functional exercises. Again, the functional meaning that you are simply doing something, you are acting upon your plan, as opposed to the tabletop exercise where you are just sitting and discussing. And then again, the full scale exercise is the lights and sirens. We're going to bring the fire department. We're going to evacuate patients. We're going to actually move people, do things that is according to our emergency operations plan. Full scale exercises can take up to a year to plan, and the vast majority of you are not going to be doing full scale exercises. You mostly are going to be doing tabletop exercises or any of these other things. And then the functional exercise, which you are required to do with community partners. And we'll talk more about how you get those community partners involved. Keep in mind that you always want to write an after action report if it's a real event, because that will count as one of your 2 required exercises for the year. And typically it's only those functional and full scale exercises or tabletop exercises that require an after action report. But it's always good to capture what the lessons learned were so that you can continue to move and improve. Again, the nomenclature capability is that big umbrella piece. It's that ability to evacuate, that ability to shelter in place, that ability to manage an infectious disease. Those are the capabilities. They're very broad, but underneath those, you have specific activities, steps that you want your staff to take in order to accomplish that capability. And many of our activities can actually be broken down into checklists or specific measurable actions that we want our staff and ourselves to be able to accomplish to ultimately fulfill that capability. There's a connection between capabilities and objectives. And this is the question that Brian always encourages us to ask ourselves. What do you hope to accomplish by performing a particular capability? So for example, if your capability is to evacuate, what you're hoping to do is to evacuate all of your patients in a timely, safe manner so that you can continue to provide the continuity of care that is required. That would be your objective, okay? So if we activate our evacuation capability and we conduct the strategies of reverse triaging our patients, of making sure that we have put together the pink vests or the paperwork that will need to accompany that patient. And once we do that by assigning a particular person to reverse triage this wing or this house or this floor, and you've assigned a particular person to print off all of the face sheets for that particular wing, house, floor, then you will have met your objective of being able to safely evacuate and maintain continuity of care. We've talked a lot about SMART objectives as being specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time limited. And we're going to give you a few more examples of that. As always, you can go to FEMA's website about HSEEP, which is the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program. As we introduced last week, you will find way more information on this site than you will actually need. But they do have a section for design and development templates. And so you can go through these and click on them and get an idea of the direction that HSEEP, or if the federal government wants you to go to get ready to design your exercise. So there's about 20 of the templates, and there's really only about 3 or 4 that you will probably actually use. Things like the discussion-based exercise placement, things like the exercise plan template, and then the measle, which we will talk a lot about in our next session. So there are 2 key components to what we're going to be talking about today. The first part is design. How do you develop your exercise? How do you design it? You have to think about who you want on your team to help you do that. You need to think about what kind of capabilities or capacities do you need to test. And then you need to develop your objectives. This is probably, it's kind of like writing a new mission statement for your organization. It's one of those things that nobody likes to do, but you got to do. And it's really foundational to being able to be successful with your exercise. The next part is the development. So once you've kind of put together all of these top pieces, then you need to continue to develop the exercise. And that means building your scenario. It means determining how you're going to progress through the exercise. It means creating documentation and then planning for all of the other things that go into this day, which is exercise logistics. How are you actually going to conduct the exercise? And then most importantly, how are you going to evaluate the exercise? A lot of number 2, we're going to talk about next week when we talk about exercise conduct. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian to talk about exercise design.
Thanks, Amy, and good afternoon, everybody. And again, thank you for taking some time out of your day to work with us. I'm going to start with some tips on how to develop that exercise design team. Really, the size of your team is dependent on the structure or the scope of the exercise that you want to conduct. Again, think back to that pyramid. The lower on the pyramid that you go, the fewer people that you should theoretically need on your design team. The higher you move up the pyramid, the more manpower, the more support you will likely need for your exercise design team. So it's scalable. So keep that in mind. Language around requirements for preparedness is definitely trending towards ensuring that you have an administrator involved, not just in the exercise, but in the development of the exercise. So being able to show or demonstrate that an administrator is part of your entire cycle of emergency preparedness, as opposed to just being a part of an after action report or just playing in the exercise, is becoming more and more important. Again, depending on the chunk that you are trying to bite off in terms of testing, a member of each of your departments or units would be a good idea to have representation from each of those departments or units if they're going to be impacted by the scenario and or the objectives that you've identified. If you happen to have a unit or a group that really isn't going to have a lot of play during the exercise, it's still a good idea, if they want and if you have the capacity, to have representation from those units, because it's only going to benefit them to learn the process of building an exercise, because they may be the primary units that are involved in upcoming exercises. And then on the day of the exercise, again, if you have a unit that may not be actively participating, have them come and be observers if you have the ability to make that happen. The more people can get absorbed in it in whatever role or capacity, the more comfort your agency is going to have in getting these exercises to be more complex and more structured and more realistic. And then don't be afraid to include those subject matter experts. An example, if you're going to have a cyber attack scenario or an IT breakdown scenario, make sure somebody from IT is part of that exercise design team, and you may only tap into them just for their subject matter expertise. You may have a group that's capable of building the exercise, doing the design and the development, but you need that person's expertise in order to put in those details necessary to make play flow smoothly. Next slide, Amy. Thank you. Basics of your design team. Generally, design team members won't play in the exercise because you have such an inside scoop on the knowledge of what is expected and what's coming next along the scenarios or the sit reps. If, however, due to simple capacity and the fact that you don't have a lot of bodies, if they need to play, we encourage you to try to put them in a non-lead role, again, to allow the other players who weren't part of exercise design to have those primary roles. If they need to be a prompter or give a tip, that is perfectly fine if you get to a point in an exercise where you're stuck. Very often we recommend that the design team transitions into the evaluators during the day of the exercise. And the advantage to that, again, is you have that pre-knowledge, you have that inside scoop, you know what to be listening or looking for as the exercise unfolds. And again, we recognize, and the reason that there are consulting emergency preparedness businesses out there is we recognize that this is a foreign concept for a lot of agencies, not just in the healthcare world. If you need to contract your exercise out, that may be your best return on investment. And through that process, that team will not only serve the purpose of facilitating your exercise, but you'll start to see, or people that are interested in this will start to see within your agency how that process works. And it's sort of a just-in-time training, so that in the future, we can hand that baton off to you and you can handle that responsibility in-house. Next slide. Again, we always talk about those capabilities to be tested. It may be dictated by your grant or your work plan. They may say you need to test capability X, capability Y, capability Z. So always look at your grant objectives, always look at your work plan. There may simply be some requirements or things that you have to test or exercise. Other things that you can consider, areas of plans that are new. Again, the newest plans are the least known to your staff. So you want to start out with, as Amy mentioned, a training, maybe very, very well be the first thing that you do with that newly developed plan. And then you start to build your capacity around getting that plan tested to a higher capacity so you can identify where the gaps are. Because when you create a new plan, there will be gaps. There also may be areas of existing plans that either through a real event or a prior exercise, you identified big old holes. Those would be great plans to update and then retest in a future cycle. And again, it could come from that prior exercise or a real event. You should always consider functions that would be activated during one of your top HVA threats. You do a hazard vulnerability assessment for a reason. It identifies the most likely things that your agency is going to encounter. Test what is most likely to be needed, okay? If your plan itself is already structured from a capability or function-based, so maybe you guys call it chapters, maybe you call it annexes, but if your plan is already developed that way, it becomes much easier to choose or select the capabilities that you want. You could say, we have a dedicated section of our plan to evacuation. That's a very easy capability and piece of your plan to pull and build an exercise around that. Excellent. The reality is, again, we're all in different places. Some of your agencies may have very robust and developed and seasoned plans that have gone through many exercise design cycles. But some of you may be very fresh and at the basics of building emergency response plans. And we will acknowledge it is tough to evaluate a poorly developed plan. The reason for that is you don't have a baseline. You don't have something to measure discussion or activities against. So again, consider if you're in a situation like that, either reaching out to agencies that you know that have robust plans. There's nothing wrong in the world of emergency preparedness with borrowing good resources from other neighbors. We strongly encourage it. But there are also adopting, I'll go back, there are also response capabilities out there that already exist. And again, it's in that HSEEP toolkit, or use the resources around you, or use your local emergency manager. You should never have to create something from scratch. It's really the point that we're trying to drive home. Even if they end up being different disciplines or provider types, they still may structure their plans in a way that would be beneficial to your agency. And evacuation, or the example that we're going to use again, evacuation is a capability that was originally designed through emergency management for flash flooding or general flooding or fire response. However, evacuation is evacuation. The tactics that happen in evacuation generally apply to all disciplines or provider types. So take what already exists, modify it to meet the needs of your agency, and that's a great way to start building a capabilities-based response plan. Next slide. And again, remember, we are not exercising to go nanner, boo-boo, you did a bad job. We are exercising to find where we are missing things that would be important in a real response. It is a quality improvement function. It's a quality improvement purpose. We do not look at individuals. We look at functions, plans, and tactics. And it's okay to fail. It's okay to fall flat on your face. That number one recommended corrective action come out of whatever exercise you may be doing should maybe then be to update or enhance your plan. Okay, so if you know that your plan is at a level that isn't very advanced yet, run your exercise, and your first corrective action may be, we need to beef up our emergency response plans. And that's a perfectly acceptable corrective action for an improvement plan. Next slide. So again, where are those capabilities? We talked about this in the first one. We're just going to remind you where those capabilities exist. The first link that you're seeing are the FEP, or the Public Health Emergency Preparedness capabilities. There are 15 of those. Feel free to borrow, beg, and steal from that capabilities list. The next set, the next link, those are the HPP, or the Hospital Preparedness capabilities. There are currently 4 of them. Within a year or two, there will likely be 8 of them. And again, pull, use, adopt, and adapt those that are beneficial or applicable to your agencies. The next box, those are the Joint Commission capabilities or functions. And again, that's an accrediting agency typically for hospitals. And then the FEMA for capabilities. FEMA would be like your local emergency management. Okay, they're responsible for the preparedness of a jurisdiction. That could be a city, it could be a county. And they have a whopping 31 capabilities that they are responsible for showing competency in. So again, good resources to be able to pull and adopt the capabilities that are appropriate to your agency. Next slide. Writing a SMART objective. This can be confusing for people, and I'll be honest, it was confusing for me starting out learning how to do it appropriately. So the example that we're going to use here, we're just going to walk through one. The capability is operational communication. Okay, And what that stands for is ensuring the capacity for timely communications in support of security, situational awareness, and operations. And then building your objective off of that, we recommend utilizing that SMART criteria. So the specific piece, make it specific. Can you measure it? It should answer the who, what, where, when, and why. Okay. The measurable, again, how will you know that it's successful during the exercise? What is the metric that you're looking for as an evaluator? Is it that the decontamination tent is set up? That's measurable. Is it that you are able to throughput 10 fake patients through the evacuation tent? Those are tangible, measurable outcomes. Is it action oriented? Can you demonstrate that something is occurring? Again, it could be this, it could be discussion, it could be doing, it'd be functional as well. And it needs to be realistic. You can't put something in as an objective that is setting your staff up for failure. If you simply don't have the capacity or the resources to do it, don't make it one of your objectives because you're going to fail at that. Look for alternative strategies or objectives. And then that time limited piece, I'm going to give you a little tip on the time limited piece after I explain what it is. But that objective should be time bound in some way, meaning there is a start time and an end time for that objective. And it's very difficult to quantify that because every incident is going to be different. And how can you say that that decontamination tent is going to be set up and you're going to be able to get 10 patients through in, how do you even know that? 45 minutes or an hour. The reason that you do the exercise is to identify how long it would take you to do that. And one of the tips that I often give agencies as we're teaching exercise design, if you get to that time limited portion of your objective and you're stuck and it's like, we truly don't know how long this would take. One of my recommendations would be at the end of your objective, saying the phrase within the first operational period. You have just quantified how long it would take to complete that objective. And the beauty of that is that first operational period, it can be anything you want. It can be 2 hours, it can be 4 hours, it can be 8 hours, it can be 12 hours. So again, if you're new and you're not sure and you can't really drill down to an exact time, using the term within the current operational period or within the first operational period, it gives you a little bit of wiggle room to be successful. So when you put it all together, an example of an objective is at the bottom, and I'm going to read through it, and you ask yourself as I'm reading through it, if it hits those red words. Demonstrate the ability of the organization's night staff, the WHO, to receive and disseminate an event alert that's action-oriented, requesting assistance utilizing the organization's notification system. Is that realistic? I think so. Regarding a hazmat spill within 15 minutes of initial notification. That's your timepiece. In accordance with the communications annex in the emergency operations plan. So did we check all 5 of the red words? I hope you see that we did. And you can just practice that. I mean, Amy and I have gone through countless activities of, okay, here's the capability. We need to identify 3 objectives out of that capability. How do we do it? And we just lay out those 5 words in red and we just start jotting notes down. And pretty soon you have the ability to make that objective flow and ensure that you're meeting each of those marked components. Next slide. So we're going to do another one together. We'll go through this one a little more quickly. So the capabilities at the top, logistics and supply chain management. Its mission areas in response. Here's your goal or objective. Deliver essential commodities, equipment, and services in support of impacted communities and survivors to include emergency power and fuel support, as well as the coordination of access to community staples, synchronize logistics capabilities, and enable the restoration of impacted supply chains. Okay. So right now we've gotten down to the goal or objective level. But what you'll see in the bullet points is, where are your activities and tactics? How are you actually going to accomplish those things? And again, hopefully you have an operational checklist that pertains to that capability that's already in your plan. If you have a checklist, you have tactics. If not, you are going to consider introducing core capability development sheets. And we have a screenshot here, again, within the FEMA HC Preparedness Toolkit. There's a section that is dedicated, entitled Core Capability Development Sheets. And the red arrow points exactly to where you can download that document. And we really wanted to just show that when you click on that first link on the image on the left, I guess it would be in the middle where the red arrow is, you will get a document uploaded that mimics the image on the lower right. And that is your core capability development sheets. And those are template sheets for several different core capabilities that are out there, and you can modify them to suit your needs. Next slide, Amy. This is an example of a core capability development sheet that we pulled from that link that is specific to logistics and supply chain management. And you can see that they lay it out in almost exactly the sequence that we've been talking about over the last two sessions. You can see that the capability is listed at the top. It tells you what the mission area is. That simply means where in the preparedness cycle are you testing it? And then it gives you a description. It talks about it may identify actual objectives or tactics. And then it actually talks about training. And that's a really, really good component, because again, if you're introducing a new capability, you want to be able to provide introductory, ongoing, and refresher training for your staff. So these are really good tools that point you to where you could have new staff or all staff, if it happens to be something new within your plan. It's going to point you to appropriate trainings. And then underneath that, it's going to talk about different partners that you may need to bring to the table for this capability. It really covers all the bases in terms of, if we're going to take this capability and put it into our plan, what holistically do we need to make that capability be successful? So you can see that there are capability targets. It identifies different resources that you may need in order to carry out that capability. And then again, you can see that it talks about partners. The validating piece is, how would you test it? And it gives you links and tips on how you would test that capability. And then it always includes a few links at the bottom for additional information. So this is about as guided of a cheat sheet that exists out there for building capability-based response plan. Next slide. So the summary around design, okay? We talked about developing that exercise design team. And again, be realistic. If you have a small staff, it's going to be a small team. If it is a complex exercise, you are going to want to pull in other members, and don't forget about those subject matter experts. Identify your capability or capabilities to be tested. Typically, when we talk about exercises, tabletops, 2 to 3 capabilities, functional exercise, maybe 2 to 3, 3 to 4, full scale exercise, they generally recommend 3 to 5. So you can see how it kind of builds. Don't overdo it. Again, recognize capacity of your staff. If you only have the capacity to test 2 capabilities, test 2 capabilities. It still can be any one of those levels of exercises. And again, a sample objective for logistics and supply management. What I want you to do is read through that, answer to yourself, or you can throw it into the chat. Let us know if the objective that we put at the bottom of this slide, if you think it meets the SMART criteria. I'm going to read it. Activate logistics and supply management and determine immediate resource needs within the first operational period. You could do a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I think Zoom has the ability to be able to do that, or you could chime into the chat. And while you're doing that, I'm going to hand it back over to Amy to finish this out.
Thanks, Brian. All right, so exercise development. I think one of the biggest challenges when I work with people who are wanting to write an exercise is they've heard a story on the news, or they've thought when they couldn't sleep at night, they came up with this great scenario that they want to test, and they try to do this backwards. Instead of identifying what capability or function you want to test and then writing a scenario to match that, they start with a scenario and then try to figure out how to fit the capabilities into the scenario. We strongly recommend that you start with those capabilities and then build a story or a scenario around that drives the play directly to the functions and the capabilities that you want to be testing. So let's say, for example, we've decided that we want to do operational coordination, which is how does our leadership team, our incident management team, our incident command team, how do they coordinate this operational response? Information sharing, which is very similar to operational communication, and logistics and supply chain management. Those are the three capabilities that we want to test. Then we need to think about what story or scenario can we create that guides play towards the recognition that those are the capabilities, those are the plans that you want your leadership team to activate. We'll tell you right now that every single exercise is going to involve operational coordination. And quite honestly, it will also include some element of communication. Because those are the two fundamental skills that we need to have when we're responding to any kind of emergency, is how do we coordinate and the operations that we need to do, and then how do we communicate with one another, either internally or externally, in order to be successful with those operations. But it's always good to include a specific, again, whether it's logistics, supply chain management, or IT failure, or cybersecurity, or shelter in place, or you can come up with any number of different other capabilities to tag on to this kind of situation. So general rules, make it realistic and simple. Don't put the flying monkeys into the scenario. We sometimes joke about the fact that, wouldn't that be funny if we did the zombie apocalypse, or, things like that. And while it makes for a great story and it entertains people during the exercise, it also can really derail you from the focus of what you're really working on. So again, make it as realistic as you can and keep it simple. Don't throw in those strange curveballs, or you will lose control quickly, believe me. Look at your plan to see what those activation triggers are for each of your capabilities. So again, if you don't have those activation triggers written into your plan, then this is a great opportunity to build your story so that it's asking that question. At what point would you be activating your incident command team? At what point would you be sheltering in place versus evacuating? So activation triggers are really important, and that is where we can often stumble because we haven't ever been pushed to that limit. So your story should push the players, should push the organization to have to make some of those difficult decisions. Remember, it's better to make those decisions in a tabletop or functional exercise than it is in real life and then make the wrong decision, right? Again, sometimes you'll end up with those staff members who are like, oh, that would never really happen. You need to encourage them not to fight the scenario, to work with you in the sense that it's just designed to try to get you where you need to be to test that particular capability. It's okay to stop play whenever you want, to take a timeout. For example, we may only want to test the first 2 activities of information sharing instead of completing the entire plan. You're really only trying to focus on, some key elements of your checklist. It's okay then to stop as the facilitator or the controller to stop the exercise and say, okay, we've met that objective. Let's now move on to the next part of the scenario. Time jumps are okay, and sometimes they're necessary, but you need to be super clear when you're using them. So for example, this last year, I've done a lot of exercises around a severe weather event that took almost a week to come to fruition. So we started with, what do you do with the warning? Or the watch? And then what do you do when it becomes a real event? And then what do you do when the power fails after 24 hours? And so we built the scenario so that it was driving people to make different decisions depending on what day of the event it was. So again, it's okay to do that, but it's important that you communicate that clearly so people don't become confused. You want to determine how long your exercise is going to be. Most adult learners can only focus for 50 minutes. So you need to either build in breaks to your exercise, or you need to have it short enough that people will stay with you and stay engaged in the process. There's 2 different ways that we do this. One is typically called an inject. So for example, you may be saying, the severe weather event has happened, you've been sheltering in place, but oops, now the inject is you just lost power. Okay, and that will change some of the decision-making that needs to happen in the exercise. Or you can create what we call sit reps, situation reports. And oftentimes an exercise will have anywhere from 4 to 5 sit reports. They tend to be narrative, where you are painting a picture of what has happened the next day or the next operational period, whereas injects tend to be smaller pieces of information, like you just lost power, or your EMR just crashed, or you've got an irate person at the front door. Okay, so there's 2 different ways of doing that. There's no right or wrong way to do this, and with practice you will find what works best with your style and with your how you choose to facilitate the exercise. Again, there's no right or wrong. Typically, when we do injects, it involves a very complex scenario. And that is called, that list of injects is what we call that master sequence of events list, or MESL, another one of those wonderful emergency preparedness acronyms to remember. And in some exercises that I've been a part of when I was down at the Center for Domestic Preparedness, the MESL, literally, it was an 8-hour exercise, and the MESL had, I think, hundreds of injects. And not every player was impacted by each inject, but there was a very clear timeline and list of sequence of events that the controllers were introducing to make the exercise more and more complicated. So most of you are probably never going to create a MESL, but we do want you to be aware of what it is. Because if you are invited to be a part of a bigger exercise, say for your county or for your city or your tribe, we want you to at least recognize it for what it is. So if you're using situation reports, again, 3 to 5 are typically produced, allowing for 3 to 5 different opportunities for play. So what we typically will do is we'll introduce report number 1, and then the group will have 15-20 minutes to play or discuss. Then we'll come back. Sometimes you have the opportunity for report outs. Other times you just move right into the next situation report. And you just continue to do that until you work through the entire exercise. We will talk a lot more about this in the next session, which is session number 3, exercise conduct. We'll have examples of sit reps and injects, as well as the kind of documentation that you're going to want, like the quick start form, to capture everything that's happening. So tricks of the trade, You know, as the facilitator or the controller, you always want to have a few more injects or scenarios up your sleeve, just in case the group truly gets stuck or stalled. Again, don't introduce the flying monkeys, but come up with some other realistic scenario or inject that will help drive the exercise forward. And it may be that people do get stuck, and that's okay. And so they may be missing a key piece of information. And as the facilitator or the controller, if you recognize that, oops, we missed this piece of information, just provide it and help the team continue to move forward. You don't want the team to get so frustrated that they just throw up their hands and quit, right? Because in a real event, you don't have that option. So help move the exercise forward as needed. And then you're going to create documentation. So at a minimum, you need to think about what kind of incident command system forms do your players need in order to be successful? One of the things that we often forget when we're in the midst of a real event is documentation, but it will become key if this is a reimbursable experience or if there's liability protection. You need to be able to demonstrate what you did in your response in order to protect the safety and well-being of your staff and your patients. So practice using those forms when you are in an exercise. You want to create either a PowerPoint or a situation report to make the exercise move smoothly. And we're going to demonstrate that again next week. You want to create these exercise evaluation guides, otherwise known as EEGs. And these are for the evaluators. They're glorified cheat sheets or notes so that people, again, are listening for specific activities and tactics and can make notes of when those things have been accomplished during the exercise. And then after the exercise, you want to make sure that you do the evaluation in an appropriate way and collect information so that you can make that improvement plan. So that includes the participant feedback form, the after action report, and the improvement plan, all of which we will discuss in session number 4. So in summary, don't write the scenario first. Figure out what your capabilities are that you want to test, and then write a scenario that meets and drives to those capabilities. You want to determine how long your exercise is going to be and how many injects or sit reps you need to develop. You need to start writing the documentation and then think about the logistics, the facilitators, the evaluators. Where is it going to be? When is it going to be? How long is it going to be? Is it going to be in person or virtual, etc.? As always, there's much, much more to come, and we're happy to answer questions if there's some right now. Otherwise, feel free to text Brian or I, or not text, email us at these emails, and we'd be happy to try to guide you as best we can. So I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Amy and Brian. Yes, again, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat, or if you prefer, you can also unmute yourself and ask a question aloud. So I'll just allow a minute or two here for you to brainstorm, see what questions you might have.
I love Brian's comment, flying monkeys and shooting laser beams of anthrax. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that tends to derail the exercise. Again, it can be really funny and it can be entertaining and all of that, but at least that's been my experience, as it can kind of help the group lose focus. Brian, how did that exercise go? Needless to say, most people died. Oh dear.
I assume so.
Any comments or questions?
All right. Well, again, as Amy said, feel free to email Amy and Brian if you think of questions beyond this point. We do have a virtual tabletop exercise coming up. There is some additional information here on this slide. And again, the slide PDF was posted in the chat, so feel free to review anything beyond this point. The virtual tabletop exercises will begin in September and run all the way through September of 2024. They do meet CMS requirements for the full-scale community-based exercise, testing functional elements of your emergency plan. So you can click that link in the slide there and you can register for the event. Some of the dates are already full, so if you are interested, definitely jump to it. So thank you again, Brian and Amy, for sharing this great information that will help all of us prepare for emergencies in our organizations. And thank you to each of you that joined us today on surely a busy Thursday. And the next webinar in this series, the third session of 4, is going to be held on August 17th. That's next Thursday. Okay, thank you all so much for joining us and have a great day.